20% of the world's oil passes through a strait less than 40 kilometers wide. On one side, Iran. On the other, Oman. Every day, roughly 21 million barrels of crude move through this corridor. Tankers so large they need 2 nautical miles of clearance between them, passing through waters where, in the last year alone, drones have struck cargo ships and naval vessels have exchanged fire. Iran sits to the north. Yemen, locked in a decade of civil war, sits to the south. Saudi Arabia presses against its western border. The United Arab Emirates carves into its northern territory. And Oman has not fought a war with any of them, not in 50 years, not in 100. In a region where borders were drawn in blood, where sectarian fault lines have split nations apart, where proxy wars have turned entire countries into rubble, one nation, sitting on one of the most contested waterways on Earth, has remained untouched. How? The answer begins not with diplomacy, but with theology. Oman is the only country in the world where the majority of the population follows Ibadi Islam, a branch of the faith that is neither Sunni nor Shia. While the rest of the Middle East fractured along the Sunni-Shia divide, a split that has fueled conflicts from Iraq to Syria to Yemen, Oman sat outside the argument entirely. Ibadism is the third branch of Islam. It predates the Sunni-Shia split by a generation, and it is practiced at scale in only one country on Earth. That theological isolation did something no treaty could. It made Oman acceptable to everyone because it threatened no one. When Iran needed a channel to speak to the United States, it was Oman they called. When Saudi Arabia and Qatar stopped speaking to each other, Oman kept the lines open. When the war in Yemen spiraled beyond control, Oman hosted the peace talks. But peace in the Middle East is never accidental. And Oman's story is far older and far stranger than its diplomacy. This is a country where frankincense was once worth more than gold, where a son overthrew his father in a palace coup and turned one of the most isolated nations on Earth into a modern state in a single generation, where an ancient irrigation system, older than Rome, still divides water among families using the position of stars against mountain peaks. And where, beneath the politics and the oil and the careful neutrality, a different kind of survival has been playing out for 5,000 years. The coastline of Oman stretches more than 3,100 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz in the north to the border of Yemen in the southwest. It faces 3 bodies of water: the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Arabian Sea. But the coast is not where Oman begins. The cultural heartland lies inland, in the valleys of the Al-Hajar Mountains, a range that rises nearly 3,000 meters and runs parallel to the northern shore like a spine of limestone and dolomite. These mountains split Oman in two. On one side, the narrow coastal plain, exposed to trade, to the sea, to the world. On the other, the interior, isolated, tribal, and deeply religious. For centuries, these two halves of Oman were almost separate countries. The coast looked outward, the interior looked inward, and the tension between them shaped everything. Beneath the surface of the Al-Hajar Range runs one of the oldest engineering systems still functioning anywhere in the world, the Aflaj. Channels, some buried 20 meters underground, that carry water from mountain springs to villages and farms across distances of 10 kilometers or more. They use no pumps, no electricity, only gravity and the slope of the land. The word falaj means to split, because the water is divided. Each family in a village receives its share on a strict rotation. The timing was once measured by a sundial during the day and by the stars at night. In the village of Al-Hijir in Wadi Bani Karus, a man named Humaid al-Hatali still manages the water this way. He is the Watil, the water master. His father held the position before him. At night, Hatali watches a specific star, Al-Thanab, as it moves against the peaks of the surrounding mountains. When it touches the summit of Al-Rus, he opens the channel for one family. When it reaches Al-Aqba, he closes it and redirects the flow to the next. Nothing is written down. The names of the stars, the peaks they align with, the sequence of families, the length of each allocation. All of it lives in his memory, passed to him by his father, who received it from his. His son Yusuf will take over one day, but Hatali knows the old knowledge may disappear with him. Modern pumps are replacing the falaj in some villages. Watchers have replaced the stars. He will not need this science anymore, Hatali says. And yet, across Oman, more than 3,000 Aflaj systems are still in use. Archaeological evidence suggests the technology dates back to at least 2,500 BC, making it older than the aqueducts of Rome by 2 millennia. 5 of these systems are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The falaj is not just an irrigation channel, it is a social contract. It requires every family to maintain their section. It requires trust. It requires cooperation. And it has held communities together in one of the driest environments on Earth for nearly 5,000 years. But the water systems of the interior tell only half the story. The other half lies on the coast, and it begins with a tree. In the Dhofar region, in the far south of Oman, the Wadi Dhaka Valley holds roughly 5,000 frankincense trees, the largest protected concentration of Boswellia sacra in the world. The trees are small, gnarled. They grow from dry, rocky ground, in a landscape that looks incapable of producing anything. And yet, from their bark comes a resin that ancient civilizations considered more valuable than gold. The Egyptians burned it in temples. The Romans carried it across the Mediterranean. The 3 gifts brought to the infant Christ, according to the Gospel of Matthew, were gold, myrrh, and frankincense. For more than 3,000 years, the trade routes that moved this resin, overland by camel caravan, by sea from the ports of Dhofar, were among the most important commercial networks in the ancient world. And Oman controlled them. Today, a harvester named Abdullah Jadad still works among the trees in the Dhofar Valley. He strikes each trunk in exactly 5 specific spots, small, precise incisions designed to let the sap bleed without killing the tree. For us, frankincense is more precious than gold, he says. It's a treasure. The highest grade of resin, pale green, translucent, with a scent that is clean and earthy and sharp, is the rarest. It is sorted by hand, graded by color and clarity, and sold in the souks of Salalah, or exported to luxury perfume houses like Amouage, which sells a single bottle containing frankincense for nearly $2,000. The UNESCO Land of Frankincense listing includes 4 sites: the Wadi Daka Grove, the ancient port of Khor Rori, the medieval harbour of Al-Balid, and the desert outpost of Shisur, once believed to be the legendary lost city of Uba, buried under the sands of the empty quarter. But Dhofar was not always a place of harvest and trade. For 14 years, it was a war zone. In 1962, a Marxist insurgency erupted in the mountains above Salalah. Fighters backed by South Yemen and the Soviet Union seized control of large swaths of the Dhofar hinterland. They called themselves the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman. Their goal was to overthrow the Sultan and establish a socialist state. Sultan Said, the father, responded with military force, but his army was small, poorly equipped, and under de facto British command. The rebels controlled the mountain passes, they controlled the villages, they had supply lines running across the Yemeni border. It was this war, more than any other factor, that convinced the British that Sultan Said had to go. His refusal to modernize was not just an embarrassment, it was feeding the insurgency. Every village without a school, every road left unpaved, every young man denied an education. All of it became recruitment material for the Marxists. After Qaboos took power in 1970, the war intensified before it ended. Iran, under the Shah, sent thousands of troops. Jordan sent special forces. British SAS units operated alongside Omani soldiers in the mountain terrain. Qaboos also launched a parallel campaign, building roads and clinics in rebel-held areas, offering amnesty to fighters who surrendered, investing in the communities that had been neglected for decades. By 1976, the rebellion was declared over. The human cost was never officially tallied, but the scars in Dhofar, physical and political, shaped the region's relationship with the central government for a generation. Many of the amnesty fighters were absorbed into the Omani military. Some rose to positions of authority. The war did not produce a clean ending. It produced an accommodation. But Dhofar holds more than trees, ruins, and scars. It holds a season that defies everything you expect from the Arabian Peninsula. From June to September, the Indian Ocean monsoon, called the Kharif, sweeps inland across the Dhofar coast. Moisture-laden clouds roll over the mountains and the landscape transforms. Brown hillsides turn green almost overnight. Waterfalls appear where there was bare rock. Mist sits in the valleys like fog in an English countryside. It is the only part of the Arabian Peninsula that catches the monsoon directly, and it turns Salalah, a city surrounded by desert on 3 sides, into something closer to the tropics for 4 months of the year. The mountains above Salalah, the Jabal Samhan range, are dense with vegetation during the Kharif, and they shelter one of the rarest predators on Earth. The Arabian leopard is the smallest subspecies of leopard in the world. It is pale, almost golden, with a coat thicker than its African relatives, adapted to the cooler mountain nights. It hunts alone, it moves at dusk and dawn, and it is vanishing. Fewer than 120 Arabian leopards remain in the wild, Most are here, in the mountains of Dhofar and across the border into Yemen. The Jabal Samhan Nature Reserve was established to protect them, but the reserve is vast and the cats are solitary. Camera traps are the primary means of monitoring them. A single confirmed sighting is treated as significant. The leopard does not know about borders. It does not recognize the line between Oman and Yemen. It crosses freely from a country at peace into a country at war and back again. Oman's waters hold their own improbable resident. The Arabian Sea humpback whale is the only population of humpback whales in the world that does not migrate. Every other humpback population on Earth travels thousands of kilometers between feeding and breeding grounds. The Arabian Sea humpbacks stay, year-round, in the waters off Dhofar. Fewer than 100 individuals remain. They are genetically distinct from all other humpback populations, isolated for so long that they have become, in effect, their own lineage. Scientists believe they separated from other humpback groups roughly 70,000 years ago. They feed in the nutrient-rich upwelling created by the Kharif monsoon, the same system that turns the mountains green. The monsoon drives cold, deep water to the surface, bringing with it the plankton and fish that sustain them. A whale that stays in one place. In a country that has made staying in one place, while the world around it burns, into a national strategy. The forts that line Oman's coast, in Muscat, in Sohar, in Sur, are reminders of the power that once occupied these shores. In 1507, a Portuguese fleet under Afonso de Albuquerque sacked Muscat. The harbour was burned. The population was massacred. For the next 143 years, Portugal controlled the Omani coast, building fortifications, taxing trade, and using Muscat as a staging point on the route to India. The twin forts of Al-Jalali and Al-Mirani still stand above Muscat harbour today, their walls built by Portuguese engineers, their cannons pointed at the sea. They were military installations designed to control access to the port and extract wealth from every ship that entered. The Portuguese era left a deep imprint on Oman. The language of Kumzar carries Portuguese loanwords. The bull-butting competitions held in the Batina coast, where two bulls push against each other until one retreats, are believed to have been introduced during the occupation. But the occupation also provoked its own undoing. In 1624, the Yarubid dynasty rose to power in the interior, united by Ibadi theology and a shared determination to expel the Portuguese. It took 26 years. In 1650, Imam Sultan bin Saif captured Muscat and drove the Portuguese from the coast entirely. It was not just a military victory, it was a turning point. The Omanis, who expelled the Portuguese, did not retreat to the mountains. They followed the Portuguese south along the African coast, seizing their colonies one by one. The empire that resulted would stretch from the Strait of Hormuz to Mozambique. To understand why Oman chose peace, you have to understand what it chose to leave behind. At its height, the Omani Empire was one of the great maritime powers of the Indian Ocean. By the 17th century, Omani sailors had driven the Portuguese from the coast, recapturing Muscat in 1650 after more than a century of occupation. They did not stop there. They took the Portuguese colonies in East Africa. They took Zanzibar. They took Gwadar on the coast of what is now Pakistan. By the early 19th century, the Omani Sultan ruled from the Strait of Hormuz to the island of Madagascar. His capital was not even in Oman. It was in Zanzibar, 1,000 miles away across the Indian Ocean. And the empire ran on slaves. The Swahili coast slave trade was not a peripheral activity. It was the economic foundation. Enslaved Africans were captured inland and marched to coastal ports, Kilwa, Bagamoyo, Zanzibar, where they were sold to plantations across the Indian Ocean world. The clove plantations of Zanzibar, which made the island one of the wealthiest in East Africa, were built on enslaved labor. At its peak, an estimated 50,000 enslaved people passed through Zanzibar's markets every year. Britain pressured successive Omani sultans to curtail the trade throughout the 19th century. Treaties were signed. They were ignored. It was not until the early 20th century that the trade was meaningfully suppressed, and slavery itself was not formally abolished in Oman until 1970. 1970. When Sultan Said bin Sultan died in 1856, his empire fractured. His sons fought over the succession. Britain, the dominant naval power in the Indian Ocean, intervened. The result was a formal division. Zanzibar and the East African territories went to one son. The Arabian territories, Muscat and Oman, went to another. The richest half of the empire was severed overnight. It was not a negotiation between equals. Britain dictated the terms. And from that moment, the Sultanate in Muscat, stripped of its most profitable possessions, began a long decline into isolation and poverty. The maritime power that had competed with the Portuguese Empire was reduced to a coastal strip, a mountainous interior it barely controlled, and a desert it had no use for. Zanzibar kept the cloves, the trade routes, the cosmopolitan culture that Omani merchants had built. Oman kept the frankincense groves, the Falaj channels, and the mountains where Ibadi scholars still argued about the qualities of a just imam. The split endured until 1964, when a revolution in Zanzibar overthrew the Omani-descended sultan and merged the island with mainland Tanganyika to form Tanzania. The Omani community in Zanzibar, some of whom had lived there for generations, was scattered. That year, 1970, is the hinge on which modern Oman turns. Everything before it belongs to one world. Everything after, to another.
Before 1970,
Oman had 3 schools, 1 hospital, 10 kilometers of paved road. There were no newspapers, no television stations, no secondary education. Sunglasses were banned, radios were banned. A person needed the Sultan's personal permission to leave their village. The ruler, Sultan Said bin Taimur, governed from his palace in Salalah and rarely left it. He kept the national treasury in a box. He refused to spend oil revenues on development. He believed that modernization would corrupt his people. A communist insurgency, the Dhofar rebellion, had been burning in the south since 1962, fueled by support from South Yemen. The Sultan's response was military suppression, funded almost entirely by Britain. His son, Qaboos, had been educated at Sandhurst, the British military academy. He had served briefly in the British Army in Germany. When he returned to Oman in 1966, his father placed him under house arrest in the Salalah Palace. For 4 years, Qaboos studied Islam and the history of his country, and waited. July 23, 1970, British-led military units move into position around the palace. Qaboos's allies confront his father. Sultan Said grabs a pistol and fires, killing one of the conspirators, a man named Sheikh Break al-Ghafri. In the chaos, the Sultan shoots himself in the foot. He barricades himself in his bedroom. A British officer named Edward Turnhill uses a megaphone to call for surrender. The only answer is automatic gunfire. When Turnhill finally enters the room, he finds the Sultan behind his desk, holding 2 pistols. Saeed hands them over. "I don't think I will need these anymore," he says. He signs a document of abdication. He is flown out on an RAF aircraft, first to Bahrain for medical treatment, then to London, where he will spend the remaining 2 years of his life in a suite at the Dorchester Hotel. His 29-year-old son is now Sultan. What follows is one of the most rapid national transformations of the 20th century. Qaboos renamed the country from Muscat and Oman to the Sultanate of Oman, a symbolic unification of the coast and the interior. He abolished slavery, he opened schools, he built hospitals, he paved roads. By 1980, 10 years, Oman had 28 hospitals, 363 schools, and 12,000 kilometers of paved roads. A telecommunications network had been laid, an airport completed, a port built. The country was electrified. Western journalists who had called Oman medieval a decade earlier stopped using the word. But the most consequential decision Qaboos made was not about infrastructure. It was about identity. He chose neutrality. Not passive neutrality, not the kind that means staying quiet and hoping no one notices. Qaboos called it positive neutrality. Oman would take no side in any regional conflict. It would maintain relationships with everyone, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Israel and Palestine, the United States and the Houthis, and it would use that position to become something the Middle East desperately lacked, a place where enemies could talk to each other, friend to all, enemy to none. It was not a slogan, it was a foreign policy doctrine, and for 50 years, it worked. Muscat today shows no trace of the country it replaced. The Sultan Qaboos Grand Mosque sits in the Borshah district, a structure of white marble and gold mosaic that can hold 20,000 worshippers. Its prayer carpet, a single continuous piece, took 600 women 4 years to weave. The chandelier in the main hall weighs 8 tons. It was, when installed, the second largest in the world. But the mosque is not ornament. It is Ibadi, and Ibadi mosques are, by tradition, modest. The Qaboos Mosque walks a line. It is grand enough to represent a modern state, restrained enough to reflect a theology that believes leaders should be chosen for piety and knowledge, not bloodline or wealth. In Ibadi Islam, the Imam does not need to be descended from the Prophet Muhammad's tribe. He does not inherit his position. He is selected by the community for his learning and his character. And if he rules unjustly, the community has the right to remove him. It is a theology that produced a different kind of politics. A sultan who held absolute power, but who understood that the legitimacy of that power rested not on divine right, but on competence. North of Muscat, the Musandam Peninsula juts into the Strait of Hormuz like a fist. It is an exclave, separated from the rest of Oman by a strip of the United Arab Emirates, and it is one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land in the world. The Musandam Peninsula itself is a landscape unlike anything else on the Arabian Peninsula. Sheer limestone cliffs plunge directly into the sea. Narrow inlets, called khors, cut deep
into the rock,
creating a coastline that looks more like the fjords of Norway than the flat shores of the Gulf. The village of Kumzar, at the northern tip of the peninsula, is accessible only by boat. Its population speaks Kumzari, a language found nowhere else on Earth, a mix of Farsi, Arabic, Portuguese, and Hindi, reflecting centuries of contact with every civilization that passed through the Strait. Fewer than 5,000 people speak Kumzari. There are no written records of the language older than a few decades. Linguists classify it as severely endangered. When the last generation of native speakers dies, the language, like so many things in this country, will survive only if someone chooses to carry it. The strait, at its narrowest, is 33 kilometers wide. Shipping lanes are divided into 2 corridors, each 3 kilometers across, with a buffer zone between them. Every tanker carrying oil from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean must pass through this gap. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz every day. That is about 1/5 of the world's total petroleum consumption. If the strait were closed, by military action, by mines, by blockade, global energy markets would collapse within days. Oman shares control of these waters with Iran. The two countries face each other across the strait's narrowest point. Their relationship is not an alliance, it is a pragmatic coexistence built on mutual dependence. Iran is Shia, Oman is Ibadi. But because Ibadism sits outside the Sunni-Shia binary, Oman has never been drawn into the sectarian proxy wars that have consumed the rest of the region. When the other Gulf states joined the Saudi-led blockade of Qatar in 2017, Oman refused. When the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, Oman kept its channel to Tehran open. When Houthi missiles targeted Saudi cities, Oman hosted the ceasefire negotiations. Being no one's enemy made Oman everyone's intermediary. Further up the Batina coast, the port of Sohar was, for centuries, the commercial capital of Oman. It was here, according to local tradition, that the legend of Sinbad the Sailor originated. Whether the stories in the 1001 Nights are based on a real Omani navigator or a composite of many is debated. What is not debated is that Omani sailors reached China. By the 9th century, Omani vessels were trading in Canton. They carried frankincense, copper, and dates eastward. They brought back silk, porcelain, and spices. The maritime route from the Gulf of Oman to the South China Sea, mapped by Omani navigators using celestial navigation and monsoon wind patterns, predated European exploration of the same waters by more than 5 centuries. Sohar today is a modern industrial port. The ancient harbor is gone. But the city's museum preserves a full-size replica of a traditional Omani sailing vessel, a reminder that this was once one of the busiest ports in the world, at a time when Oman's reach extended further than most empires. Further south, along the coast below Muscat, the town of Sur sits at the mouth of a creek that opens to the Gulf of Oman. For centuries, Sur was one of the great dhow-building ports of the Indian Ocean. Omani shipwrights constructed vessels from teak imported from India, stitched together with coconut fiber rope instead of nails, waterproofed with a coating of animal fat and lime. These ships carried Omani sailors to India, to China, to the Malay Peninsula, and down the East African coast. By the 15th century, Omani navigators had mapped trade routes that reached Southeast Asia, decades before the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope. The dhow-building tradition in Sur continues today, one of the last places in the Arabian Peninsula where these vessels are still built by hand. But the boats are smaller now, the yards quieter. The trade routes they once served have been replaced by container ships. What remains is the knowledge, the curve of a hull that a shipwright's great-grandfather would recognize, the smell of teak shavings, the sound of a mallet driving wood into place. South of the Al-Hajar Range, the mountains give way to gravel plains, and then to sand. The Wahiba Sands stretch across eastern Oman, a sea of dunes that reach more than 100 meters in height. They are part of the larger Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest sand desert on Earth, covering an area the size of France across Oman, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the UAE. The temperature at the surface can exceed 55 degrees Celsius. Rainfall is measured in single-digit millimeters per year, and yet Bedouin communities have lived here, moving with the seasons, navigating by dune shape and wind direction for generations. The desert
Does not forgive.
miscalculation. A wrong turn means no water, no shade, no second chance. The Bedouin who remain know this landscape the way Hamid al-Hattali knows the stars, through inherited memory, earned over lifetimes. Somewhere beneath the sands of the southern desert lies what may be one of the oldest urban settlements in the Arabian Peninsula. Shisa, also known as Uba, was a waypoint on the ancient frankincense trail. Caravans carrying resin from Dhofar to the ports of the Mediterranean stopped here for water. The settlement was mentioned by Ptolemy, by Pliny the Elder, and in the 1001 Nights, where it appears as Iram of the Pillars, a city destroyed by God for the arrogance of its people. In 1992, a team using NASA satellite imagery identified a site where ancient caravan routes converged in the desert near Shisa. Excavation revealed a fortress built over a limestone cavern. The cavern had collapsed, taking part of the
Settlement with it.
possibly centuries ago. The dating placed the site as far back as 2800 BC. Whether Shisra is the legendary Ubar or simply one of many desert outposts is still debated. But the site, half buried, partially collapsed, standing at the edge of the empty quarter, carries the weight of a story that people have been telling for 3,000 years. A city swallowed by the desert. A warning about what the sand takes back. In the central desert of Oman, the vast stony flats of the Al-Wusta region, another kind of persistence was tested. The Arabian oryx is a white antelope with long, straight horns and a shoulder hump that gives it a silhouette unlike any other desert mammal. Its coat reflects the sun. It can regulate its body temperature to avoid overheating. It can survive for weeks without drinking water, drawing moisture from the plants it eats. By 1972, the Arabian oryx was extinct in the wild. Hunting, from jeeps and helicopters by wealthy sportsmen across the Arabian Peninsula, had eliminated every last free-ranging individual. 10 years later, in 1982, Oman reintroduced a captive-bred herd into the Al-Wusta Wildlife Reserve. It was the first reintroduction of an extinct-in-the-wild species in the region. The animals came from zoos and private collections in the United States and Europe, descendants of a handful that had been captured before the species vanished. The recovery was fragile. Poaching continued. The reserve's boundaries were reduced. In 2007, the Arabian Oryx Sanctuary became the first site ever removed from the UNESCO World Heritage List, a decision driven by Oman's reduction of the protected area by 90% to allow oil exploration. But the oryx survived. Breeding programs expanded. Herds now roam protected areas across Oman and several neighboring countries. The species has been reclassified from extinct in the wild to vulnerable, an animal that was erased from the landscape, brought back by the same species that erased it. On the eastern tip of Oman, where the land narrows to a rocky headland facing the open Arabian Sea, the beach at Ras Al Jins goes dark after sunset. And then the turtles come. Green sea turtles, adults weighing up to 160 kilograms, haul themselves from the surf and up the sand. They dig nests with their rear flippers. They lay between 100 and 200 eggs, and then they drag themselves back to the water and disappear. This has been happening here for 90 million years, not a figure of speech. Sea turtles have been nesting on this stretch of coast since the late Cretaceous period, since before the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs. Ras Al Jins is one of the largest green turtle nesting sites in the Indian Ocean. Each year, up to 30,000 female turtles return to these beaches. The hatchlings emerge weeks later, usually at night, and make their way to the sea by the light of the moon. The reserve restricts access to protect the nesting grounds. Visitors are guided in small groups, in darkness, and photography uses only natural light. The turtles are not a spectacle. They are a process, a cycle that has outlasted every civilization that has ever stood on this shore. Nizwa sits in the interior of Oman, at the base of the Al-Hajar Mountains, surrounded by date palm groves fed by the Falaj channels. For centuries, it was the capital of the Ibadi Imamate, the religious and political center of Oman's interior. Its round tower, built in the 17th century, 24 meters high, with walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire, stands as the largest of its kind in the Arabian Peninsula. But Nizwa's significance is not military, it is theological. Ibadi Islam arrived in Oman in the 8th century. Scholars fleeing persecution in Basra, in what is now Iraq, brought the faith to the mountains. They found a population receptive to a theology that emphasized communal governance, elected leadership, and strict accountability. The mountains helped. Oman's interior was isolated enough to shelter a minority sect from the empires, Umayyad, Abbasid, Ottoman, that might have suppressed it. The same geography that kept the Aflaj running kept Ibadism alive. Today, roughly 45% of Oman's Muslim population is Ibadi. Another 45% is Sunni. About 5% is Shia. And the government, deliberately, promotes a form of generic Islam that downplays the differences. Sunni imams lead prayers in Ibadi mosques. Ibadi congregants pray behind Sunni prayer leaders. The Grand Mufti of Oman, the country's highest religious authority, has stated publicly that the differences between Ibadi and Sunni Islam are subsidiary issues of little eternal consequence. In a region where sectarian identity has been weaponized to justify invasions, civil wars, and proxy conflicts. Oman built its national identity on the deliberate blurring of sectarian lines. It is not tolerance as an ideal, it is tolerance as a survival strategy. South of Nizwa, the fortress of Bala rises from the date palm groves, a UNESCO World Heritage Site surrounded by a 12-kilometer mud brick wall. Locals have long associated Bala with the supernatural. It is Oman's city of jinn, spirits that, according to tradition, inhabit the old walls and the caves beneath the fort. The stories are folklore, but they reflect something real about the interior, a sense of apartness, of traditions so deep and so local that outsiders struggle to map them. And there are things about modern Oman that resist scrutiny. The Sultanate is not a democracy. Political parties are banned. The press is controlled. During the Arab Spring protests of 2011, demonstrators in Sohar and Salalah
Demanded reforms.
jobs, an end to corruption, greater representation. Some were detained. Reports emerged of sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, and other mistreatment of prisoners. Qaboos responded with a mix of concessions and repression. He sacked several ministers. He expanded the powers of the elected Consultative Council. But he also tightened restrictions on media and public assembly. The neutrality that Oman practices abroad does not extend to domestic dissent. The same government that mediates between global adversaries maintains tight control over its own population's ability to criticize it. Peace for Oman has always been a project managed from the top. Above Nizwa, the road climbs into the Jebel Akhdar, the Green Mountain, a high plateau that rises to nearly 3,000 meters. The terraces here are ancient, carved into the mountainside over centuries, irrigated by afflage channels that carry water from springs higher up.
Slope.
Rosewater is distilled from damask roses grown on these terraces. Pomegranates ripen in the cooler air. Walnuts and apricots grow in orchards that would look more at home in the Mediterranean than in the Arabian Peninsula. The Jebel Akhdar was also the last stronghold of the Ibadi Imamate. In the 1950s, a tribal revolt against the Sultan's government, backed by Saudi Arabia, erupted in the mountains. The Imam's forces held the high ground. British Special Air Service troops were deployed to support the Sultan. It took 2 years to break the resistance. The Imamate was dissolved. The interior was brought under the Sultan's direct control, and the centuries-old tension between coast and interior, between Sultanate and Imamate, was settled, finally, by force. Sultan Qaboos ruled for 49 years and 171 days. He never married. He had no children. He was diagnosed with colon cancer in 2014 and spent his final years traveling between Oman and Europe for treatment. Under Omani constitutional law, the royal family had 3 days after the Sultan's death to agree on a successor. If they could not agree, a sealed letter left by the Sultan would be opened, naming his choice. January 10th, 2020, Sultan Qaboos dies. The royal family opens the letter the following day. It names his cousin, Haytham bin Tariq, a man who had served as Minister of Heritage and Culture, not a military figure, not a diplomat, a man whose career had been devoted to preserving the past. Haytham inherited a country that owed its modern existence to one man's vision. The question was whether the institutions Qaboos built, the neutrality, the tolerance, the careful balance between tradition and modernity, could survive without the person who built them. Oman's economy depends on oil. It always has. Petroleum revenues make up roughly 70% of the government budget. But Oman's reserves are modest compared to its neighbors, Analysts estimate they may last no more than 15 to 20 years at current production rates. Vision 2040. The country's economic diversification plan is built around tourism, logistics, and the development of the port of Duqm, a massive industrial complex on the Arabian Sea coast designed to become a regional trade hub. Duqm is ambitious. A dry dock capable of servicing the world's largest vessels, a refinery, a petrochemical complex, special economic zones. The vision is that Duqm will do for Oman what Jebel Ali did for Dubai, become a global logistics node that reduces the country's dependence on oil. But Duqm also represents something else. Infrastructure of this scale makes Oman strategically significant in a way it has never been before. And strategic significance in the Middle East attracts attention. Not all of it welcome. The role Oman played in the Iran nuclear deal remains one of the most consequential acts of quiet diplomacy in 21st century history. In 2013, secret talks between the United States and Iran took place in Muscat. Not in New York, not in Geneva, in the capital of a country most Americans could not find on a map. Sultan Qaboos had spent years building the channel. He maintained personal relationships with
Both American presidents
and Iranian leaders, a feat no other head of state in the region could match. He offered Oman as neutral ground. Both sides accepted. The Muscat talks laid the groundwork for what became the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, signed in 2015. It was the most significant diplomatic agreement between the United States and Iran in nearly 4 decades. Oman did not draft the deal. It did not enforce it. It simply provided the room, the physical, political, and theological space where two governments that had not spoken directly in 34 years could sit across a table and negotiate. The JCPOA unraveled after the United States withdrew in 2018. Sanctions were reimposed. Iran accelerated its nuclear enrichment. But Oman kept the channel open. Even after the deal collapsed, Muscat remained the only capital through which Washington and Tehran would reliably communicate. When American citizens were detained in
Houthi-controlled Yemen,
it was Oman that negotiated their release. When the crew of the Galaxy Leader, a cargo ship seized by the Houthis, needed to be freed, Oman brokered the deal. When ceasefire talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis were needed, Muscat hosted them. The pattern was always the same. A crisis erupts. The parties involved cannot speak to each other directly, and someone picks up the phone and calls Oman. Not because Oman is powerful, its military is modest, its economy is smaller than many American cities. Its population is just over 5 million. But because Oman, by theology, by geography, by 50 years of deliberate strategic quietism, became the one country in the Middle East that everyone trusts enough to talk through. That trust was not built in a single meeting. It was built over decades by a sultan who understood that in a region where every other country was choosing sides, the most powerful position
was to choose none.
But neutrality, in 2026, is under pressure in ways it has never been before. In 2025, Israeli military strikes targeted Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran retaliated with attacks on shipping in the Gulf of Oman. Drone strikes hit the commercial port of Duqm, Oman's crown jewel of economic diversification on the Arabian Sea coast. A tanker was struck off the Musandam Peninsula. The vessel carried Indian and Iranian crew members. The attack did not distinguish between nationalities or alliances. It simply happened in Omani waters. The regional order that Oman navigated so carefully, the balance of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between the United States and its adversaries, is fracturing. The 2023 Saudi-Iranian normalization, mediated partly by Oman and partly by China, offered a brief window of de-escalation. That window is closing. Experts who once called Oman the Switzerland of the Middle East now question whether the label still applies. Switzerland's neutrality was guaranteed by geography, mountains on all sides, and no strategic choke point running through its territory. Oman sits on the Strait of Hormuz. Its neutrality was never guaranteed by terrain. It was guaranteed by trust. And trust, in a region where deterrence is replacing diplomacy, is a diminishing asset. If Duqm becomes a target, if the port that represents Oman's economic future is drawn into the wider conflict, Muscat may be forced to choose between its theological neutrality and a formal security alliance to protect its infrastructure. That choice, if it comes, would end the friend to all, enemy to none era, and it would alter the diplomatic architecture of the entire Gulf. There is a word in Arabic, sabr. It means patience, but it means more than patience. It carries the weight of endurance, of bearing what must be borne without complaint, of staying when leaving would be easier. Oman's frankincense trees still grow in the same dry valleys where they grew 3,000 years ago. The Falaj still carries water through channels carved before the birth of Rome. The turtles still nest on beaches where they nested before the first human being set foot on the Arabian Peninsula. And in Muscat, in Nizwa, in Sur, in the Dhofar Mountains, a country of 5 million people continues to practice something the rest of its region has largely abandoned: the belief that peace is not weakness, that silence is not surrender, that the most powerful thing a nation can do is refuse to fight. Whether that belief can survive what is coming, whether Oman's children will inherit the neutrality their parents built, is a question no one in Muscat can answer. The stars still cross the mountain peaks above Al-Hijir. The water still flows, but the Wakil's son may never learn the names. Some knowledge survives only as long as someone chooses to carry it. Thanks for watching. If journeys like this one interest you, subscribe to Where on Earth, and we'll see you on the next road.